So let's review what we've just spoken about. We've talked about timelines and the importance of those timelines. So let's keep in mind from the point of the referral process, when you're writing that letter, when you're requesting that your child be evaluated, the school has 10 days to sit down with you and a group of professionals and have that conversation. Number two, the evaluation should be taking place 10 days after you have signed your written consent. The eligibility determination from that point can take up to 60 days. So it's an important part of keeping part of those timelines. After that eligibility is determined, the school has 15 school days to get that IEP completed. And from that IEP completion, they have 10 days to implement that IEP. So that's, again, just kind of summing up what we've just talked about. Next, we're going to move into having more of a conversation about the evaluation process. The members of that evaluation team are actually the same, play the same roles as the IEP team. So when you look at this slide, although there's a lot of different people that can be part of this conversation, there needs to be 4 people actually sitting at that table. A parent, a regular ed teacher of the child, no less than 1, not less than 1 special educator of the child, or at least someone with special education credentials at that table. And lastly, someone from the LEA, the local education agency, meaning the school district, who is decision maker. They have the ability to understand the resources that are available. It becomes a very important part of making these meetings legal meetings. Without those players, we cannot make those decisions. And what we don't want to see happen, and we see it less and less, but occasionally it still happens, where an IEP team gets together, or what we think is a legal IEP meeting, and we spend our hour or 2 hours or whatever it is developing that IEP, and we get to the end and someone says, okay, well, we can't move this forward until we have the special ed director check it out. If the special ed director cannot be the LEA at that meeting, and many of them are not, they have, or they should be assigning someone else to act on their behalf. And that becomes a really important part. So what a parent can do is kind of check in at the beginning of the meeting. Make sure that they've gotten a letter ahead of time. We'll talk about that again a little bit further in the workshop. That's the meeting notice. And it'll say who's coming to those meetings and what their role is. If you've got names on a piece of paper but you don't know what role they're playing, please make sure you ask that, because you want to know that when you're going into a meeting, if this is a decision-making group, that we will be able to make those decisions by the end of that meeting. In addition, there are additional people that can come to that meeting, certainly an individual who can interpret evaluation results. So especially in an evaluation meeting, if we've had a speech and language evaluation done, we want to make sure there's a speech and language professional at that table who can interpret those results. We don't just want the teacher down the hall coming in and reading that information. They need to be able to give it in a way to parents so that parents can understand a lot of this information that can be very difficult. Certainly there can be others with expertise, knowledge or expertise on the student. I like to use the example of my son, who has a lot of challenges, but when he was in high school, the regular ed teacher that came to his IEP meetings, because he was in a self-contained classroom, ended up being this wonderful, wonderful man who was the woodshop teacher. And that was the one class that Matthew got to go to, and he shined in that class. And that teacher actually asked to be part of Matt's IEP. And what happened in that moment, you know, as we have this focus on so many other different areas that Matthew needed to work on, we found that Matthew had all these other great skills that we didn't even know existed. That information became so important for the rest of the IEP. What did the environment look like? How was it he is supported in that classroom? And it really is important to think outside the box when we are bringing people to those IEP meetings. And lastly, in Rhode Island, a child starts to reach that transition age at age 14. Now, federal law is age 16. This is one of those areas, you know, we're very proud to say that Rhode Island went over and above the federal regulations, meaning that we want to see students participating in these meetings as best they can, beginning no later than age 14. I've been saying recently in a lot of these workshops that Ideally, when we start to look at our young teens, that eventually they will leave school. There will be no more IEP. If there was one goal for every student that has an IEP in school, one of those goals would be that they are facilitating and presenting their own IEP meeting before they leave high school. It would be a great goal, and by starting at age 14 in Rhode Island, it gives them a lot more time to start practicing. So the role of the evaluation team looks a little bit different than the role of the IEP team. Their goal is to take those evaluations, sit down, review them, first of all have the conversation about what evaluations. They determine what type, the eligibility piece. They're the ones doing writing up the report afterwards and sharing that information with the IEP team. What's more important to understand, one of the big differences between the evaluation team and the IEP team is that the evaluation team does not determine services, supports, and placement. And here's why that is so important. I know a lot of times people don't always think that that's a big deal, but here's what the example would be in that situation. Going back many years, when a lot of times evaluation teams were sitting down with families, having conversations about a child's learning disability, autism, their medical needs, and in that process with that data, immediately saying, okay, well, you know what? Johnny's got the learning disability, so we're going to put him in Mrs. Jones's classroom in such and such school. Or Matthew has autism, and we're going to put him in that autism classroom down the hall. And what happens is we start to lose sight of the individual part of an individual education plan. So those IEPs start looking more like they're being written for that placement, that program, the supports that are available. You know, one of the things we say about kids with autism in specific is if you know one kid with autism, you only know about one kid with autism. The needs that my child or your child require in a school are going to be vastly different. There's no one that can say that, you know, this child may need speech 5 days a week, this child may need speech twice a week. But we won't know that until we sit down and really plan that out, write those goals, objectives, and really map out that process. So again, that becomes a really big difference when you're sitting there as an eval team before you're moving into that IEP team process. So in the process of determining eligibility, what happens is that the school needs to fit that student into one of these categories that you see here on the slide. It's pretty much a ticket to service. There are many, many diagnoses, many disabilities out there, but these are the categories that they would need to fit into. What we're going to be looking at, or what the team is going to be looking at, does this disability adversely affect their educational performance? Not every person, not every child, not every student with ADHD requires special education. There are even some students out there, you know, with different, even on the autism spectrum, that may not need special education. They may need other levels of support, but they don't need specialized instruction. So that's what we're looking at. Simply because a child has a label doesn't necessarily mean that it adversely affects their educational performance. So that's what we're really measuring. And in that process of measuring, we are not only just looking at academic performance, we're looking at functional performance. So in your head, I want you to think, when you hear the word educational performance, you're thinking academic and functional at all times. We need to be measuring and looking at that. So here's the evaluation procedures. They cannot discriminate on the basis of race and culture. We need to be measuring what that child knows and can do academically and functionally. And they need to be provided in the child's native language. We're finding some great best practices that are going on in Rhode Island where some districts that aren't quite sure are actually doing those evaluations in multiple languages, just to make sure. We want to make sure that if this child is a child with a disability, we want to make sure we're providing the right supports. But if this is a child that needs English language services, those kind of supports, then that's the direction. What we want to make sure is we're not doing the opposite. And in the past, that has happened. So it becomes a really important piece of this process. Also, that schools are using multiple ways of getting that information. That we're using information, assessment tools, strategies that are really going to measure what works for that child, and what works for one child may not work for another child. So it really becomes an important part of this process. When we talk about reevaluations, the process is the same. The timelines are the same. So a child is reevaluated after 3 years or even after a year, but the process, those timelines are exactly the same. Schools are not to be conducting that same evaluation more than one time a year. But they do need to be looking at this minimally at least every 3 years. We really encourage parents to be part, when that 3-year timeline comes around, to have an open, honest conversation. Not every student needs to be evaluated again. Some do. The question on the table is always, is the data that we're currently using to create this IEP, does this reflect what's happening with my child right now? And if it's not, then we need to go back to that table and look at what type of evaluative data that we still do need. Ideally, every year we write an IEP. We should be asking that question right up front. Have we got everything we need? Is this the stuff that we've been gathering over the year? Does this help us to write this IEP, or do we need more? So again, that reevaluation process isn't limited. So as I was just saying, one of the most important questions that we want parents to ask all the time, we want professionals to be sitting back and kind of looking at, do we have what we need before we move this forward? Not to just take information and kind of copy it and paste it and putting in for the next year, but making sure that that data is accurate. When we have students that, and we get, a lot of the calls that we get from parents may be from families where kids are just failing over and over again. And what does that failure look like? Well, some of it may be academic, which kind of glares in your face, that the student is progressively not achieving academically. But we also get the calls from the families, well, maybe academics are fine, but functionally that student is having difficulty. They're having difficulties with interpersonal, working with other students, social emotional issues. That becomes part of the looking at, is that child being successful? We know, because we get these calls and we hear the data out there, that we have a high number of highly functioning students, specifically on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, who are able to pass tests, who are able to knock out those kneecap scores and get that information. And when they exit high school, they don't have the functional skills. They need to be able to go out and apply for a job, to enter a college. So we have to be very mindful as parents of what kind of things are we making sure that are taking place, especially in that transition process out of high school. So now we've gathered all this information. So the evaluation team and the family together, here's what we're looking for in that data. We're looking for the specific strengths of that student, the specific areas of need. Where is that student right now? What's their present level of performance? We're looking at what effect the disability is having on the functioning in the general ed curriculum. That's what we're looking at trying to measure. And then what kind of modifications do we need to put in place in that general ed setting so that that student can have a level of success? Again, being mindful of those functional skills. We need to make sure that they, at least, when I say addressed, they're at least looked at. They may not have needs in those areas, but making sure that we're gathering what are the strengths for that student in those areas. One of the little tips that we say to families, if you're able to, and you should be able to get a copy of that evaluation prior to the meeting where we're sitting down and talking about eligibility. Take 2 highlighters, go through the document, and sometimes this is very difficult, but take one of those highlighters and go through and look for the words that might look like challenges, things that might say below average, below grade level, struggles with. Highlight those words. And then take a different color and go in and look for those things that look like strengths, those positive, above average, an asset, strong skills in this particular area, and highlight those. And if you want, write yourself a list. and put those words on a list so that when you go into a meeting, now you're really looking at, you are going to be listening for, what are we talking about? What are we focusing on in this IEP, and what goals are we making sure that we're actually addressing those challenges in that IEP? So here's just a review at this point of that evaluation process. Minimally, as I said earlier, 4 members of that evaluation team. There can certainly be more, but remember what those roles were. An evaluation requires written parental consent. Schools cannot be evaluating students, formally evaluating without consent from parents. The evaluation is to determine whether a child is eligible. Remember, we said just because a child has a disability or a diagnosis doesn't automatically mean that they require specialized instruction. And that the information really is a true reflection of that child's present level of performance, because that's the data that we need to use to write that IEP. The next piece that we're going to be working on is the IEP process.